I grew up partially in Egypt when I was in high school, so I spent 3 years in Egypt. I started to really want to find a photo project I could start working on more long-term. I was thinking about the Nile and Egypt. I found that Ethiopia had actually built a massive hydroelectricity dam on the headwaters of the Blue Nile. So that automatically just sparked my interest. I was like, oh, this is a great way I can return to Egypt, a place I love, a place I haven't worked yet. In 2021, Ethiopia began to fill the reservoir behind the dam. And so I thought it was really important I get there to kind of document what Egypt looks like as a before picture, with the idea of continuing to return over the next 5, 10, 15 years to see how that continues to change. If there is a change, is it positive, is it negative? This first photo, it does kind of look like a before picture. It shows like the lush green farmland of Egypt. And like this is pretty common scene along the Nile. On the banks, it's a lot of date production, farming, agriculture. And then past the banks, this sprawling desert. But there's the green belt following the river through the country. I thought this was a great photo to lead with because it shows the Nile at its healthiest, water flow, greenery. This next photo definitely shows the other side of that where, Egypt has such a large population that it's really started to sprawl out into the cities. When I was going into the project, I was really realizing how important population was. Like at the end of the day, the more people you have, the harder it is on the ecosystem. I think Egypt's biggest hurdle to overcome is like, how do they get more efficient now that this dam is really in place? They're holding back water. Ethiopia and Egypt haven't been able to come to an agreement at all. I think moving forward, Egypt's got to be thinking like, okay, well, we have to maximize our efficiency however we can. This photo, it's definitely untold if the dam will be beneficial for Egypt or not. The sense I got there while talking with people was that it's such an ancient part of their culture. But now in a modern era, it's difficult to have the conversation of like, the Nile is a shared resource. There's 11 countries that use it as a water source. The bigger conversation is how do you manage or co-manage these natural resources so that they benefit everyone and uses the resource in the most efficient way. Because this shows a lot of what the infrastructure around Egypt looks like as far as irrigation. This was taken in the south of Egypt, outside of Aswan, near the High Aswan Dam. Behind the High Aswan Dam is Lake Nasser, which is where they generate all their electrical power for Egypt. But the issue here is Lake Nasser is the largest and most shallow reservoir in all of Africa. And when it's in the south of Egypt, it means there's a ton of evaporation. So the reservoir alone loses like 14 billion cubic meters of water a year, which is unfathomable. It's like a quarter of the Nile's flow, and that's just gone out of the system. No one will be able to use that for drinking water. No one will be able to use that for farming. It's just gone. Obviously, it comes back in the cycle, but it doesn't make it downriver to the people. I think this photo shows a lot of Egypt's outlook on the situation as a whole. I think it shows where you have this man standing in just the open desert sprawling behind him. I think that's where Egypt currently is. They've been facing water scarcity for quite some time. And now with the dam as a catalyst, they're extremely resistant to giving any water to the other countries. I also think that behind the man, you have an electrical pole. And I think that kind of shows some of the blind spots that some Egyptians might have. They might not have water security, but they do have reliable power, especially compared to Ethiopia, which is one of the most underpowered countries in Africa. There's a bit of pointing fingers where, yes, Ethiopia is threatening some of their water, but at the same time, Ethiopia has dismal grid connection, has dismal access to power. And obviously, like, if Egypt was in that situation, I'm sure they'd also be wanting to figure out how to get their nation power and sustainable energy. This one's a scary image for me. It feels so bleak. It does feel like this is kind of where Egypt is headed. As their population continues to grow, they have to grow food for all those people. And without water, it's extremely hard to grow that much food. And you're in a desert. You have these little green buds trying to bust through the ground. But it is a really hard situation of figuring out how to provide enough food and water for that people. This is taken in some rows of nursery. This is like a fairly sized farm. It's not quite mom and pop shop, but like they'll sell this, locally around the little markets and stuff for produce. A difficult problem for Egypt is figuring out how their farming can be more sustainable. What they do right now is a lot of farmers will flood their fields. And that flood water kind of just goes back into the water system, which is fine and it works to a degree. But as they use more pesticides, fertilizers, and toxic industrial chemicals, that actually starts to get cycled into the water flow. As you go down the Nile towards the coast, it compounds until the water is completely degraded and the quality is no longer drinkable. So that's another thing where Egypt is looking at and thinking, how can they continue to just crank up the dial a little bit and make things more sustainable, make things more efficient, make things more healthy for the ecosystem. I think this photo is kind of startling compared to the previous one. This shows the contradiction in Egypt. This is actually where I lived growing up in Madi, it's like a, upper middle class suburb of Cairo. It was founded by the British when they still owned Egypt. And the history is really interesting and it ties in with the project. In the 1800s, Britain was using Egypt to grow all their food and export it back to the UK. It's strange when you walk around Madi, it's like this little oasis. There's green grass everywhere, palm trees. It's a beautiful city, but it doesn't feel like you're living in the desert. You look around and you're like, I'm not sure how sustainable it is to have green grass in everyone's lawn. This image is taken in Ethiopia. So this is the second half of the project. In 2022, I went to Ethiopia to start working on that side of the story. This is the headwaters of the Blue Nile. It's not where the dam is built, but this is the highlands. It shows well the comparison of what the two countries look like. Here you have rolling hills, vegetation, and running water. When Egypt thinks of Ethiopia, this is what they think of. They see a lot of greenery and the moisture and think, okay, you have all the water you could ever need. Please don't touch ours. Ethiopia is facing a different set of problems. Their main issue and the reason for the Grand Renaissance Dam is electrical power. They're hoping to provide its population with consistent power. When you look at that, it's a major factor in prosperity, family health, business development, all those things. As far as like a country needs to grow, they're not able to because they don't have access to power. I think this photo is interesting because you have both things happening in one frame. Above, you have, a single power line, kind of outdated infrastructure going into the countryside. And then below, you have men harvesting trees for construction or home use. It really shows both in one frame well. This is just a great snapshot. This is a hotel kitchen. They've got a lone wire running into the kitchen, probably a bare bulb, so they can have light while they're cooking. This is a pretty standard electrical setup, I'd say. Once you get outside of the main cities, most folks are tying into the grid illegally. Power meters are so expensive, people can't afford them. What communities will do is one person might buy a power meter and then everyone will tie into it and pay that person rent so they can use the power meter. But then what happens is you have all these homemade power connections and they're unreliable. I'm sure they're not the safest. There's a large problem with people running power lines over roads and then trucks coming and accidentally hitting them. I liked this photo because it shows the hopefulness of what the dam can provide. Ethiopia is becoming a real economic powerhouse in Africa. There's a ton of business in a lot of the cities. And like, this was a young man I met, and him and two other partners rented out a small shop space and they had a welding shop. He was really positive and was really excited about the amount of work he can do and making a living for himself. But his biggest complaint was when you look at their welding takes electricity. You have to have it hooked up the whole time. And he showed us how they get their electricity. He was complaining 3-4 times a day, it just cuts out. And we don't know, do we just go home for the day? Do we wait around for an hour? And their whole day is just shot. So it's interesting just thinking about, here's a young man really striving, really pushing himself. It's just not quite there. The infrastructure is just not there to support him. This is a good photo kind of showing some of the biomass that average Ethiopians will use. Common scene while you're driving around country roads is you'll have bales of charcoal being sold. And folks will do this out of the back of their house. They'll have some trees and make burn piles, create the coal, and then sell it. My fixer actually grabbed one and threw it in his truck. Folks use coal all over the country, no matter what demographic you're at, to provide energy. There's also, there's so many health issues with that, family health issues with that too. When you have young kids growing up around that amount of smoke, it really damages respiratory systems. The health issues show how intertwined everything is, right? Like, you don't necessarily think like, oh, water, how does that affect someone's respiratory system when they're growing up? People are burning biomass and there's smoke. All these things are interconnected. This is the photo I wanted to end on because I think it kind of shows a little bit of hope. I just like the light kind of pulling you into the image. This was taken out in a fairly rural area where folks are still living in a more traditional system, cooking in the home, living away from grocery stores, and the majority of access to anything we see as modern. I think these are the fringe cases where it's really hard to see how they'll get benefit out of this. And when asking them what they foresaw with the dam, they were excited about it. Their wants and needs were a place to charge a cell phone, have a cold beverage, have a fan at night, those things. And the fan was so surprising. I was talking to this mother. It improves our quality of sleep so much. If it's cooler, my kid's not crying, I'm more comfortable, I'm able to sleep better, and then I have a better day the next day. I think those are some of the smaller things that we take for granted. I thought this is a good image to end on because it shows the light at the end of the tunnel, metaphorically. I definitely wanted to spend time in both these places and really try to dig in to see what it looked like from the inside, not necessarily just the sparse reporting you see online, to get a better sense of like what people's feelings were towards the project, the dam, each other, neighboring countries. I always want to make sure I'm shooting work that reflects the truth in the most positive way I can. And I felt like this photo kind of did that.